I know we're not in Kansas.
She didn't become addicted overnight, and she didn't choose it the way people often think. Because long before anyone called it a problem, it was already part of her routine. They gave her something to help her sleep, then something to wake her up, then something to keep her focused. And when that stopped working, they adjusted it, changed it, refined it. It wasn't chaotic. It was controlled, structured, almost clinical. And the strangest part is, no one around her saw it as dangerous, not at first. Because this wasn't happening in secret. It wasn't hidden, and it wasn't even questioned. It was happening inside one of the most powerful systems in Hollywood. And the person at the center of it all was still a teenager, too young to fully understand what was happening, too young to question the people making the decisions, too young to realize that something was slowly changing in a way that wouldn't be easy to reverse. Years later, people would look back and call it addiction, a personal struggle, a tragic downfall. But that explanation leaves something out. Because when you look closely at how it all began, it starts to feel less like a choice and more like something that was introduced, step by step, until it became impossible to separate from her life. Which raises a question that becomes harder to ignore the deeper you go into this story. Was she ever really in control? Or was that control taken from her long before anyone noticed?
The world knew her as Judy Garland, the girl behind the voice that could hold an audience in complete silence, the face behind Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, a symbol of innocence, warmth, and something almost untouchable. On screen, everything about her felt effortless. The emotion, the presence, the connection, it all seemed natural, as if she was simply born that way. She wasn't just admired, she was trusted, the kind of star people believed in without hesitation. Her performances didn't just entertain, they created a feeling, something comforting, something familiar, something real. And that image became her identity, carefully shaped, carefully maintained, repeated over and over until it felt permanent. But perfection like that rarely exists without pressure. And the more consistent the image becomes, the more effort it takes to hold it in place. Because behind that version of her, the one the public saw, there were parts of her life that didn't fit the story. Details that were never meant to be visible. Patterns that only start to make sense when you step back and look at everything together. And once you do that, once you stop looking at the image and start looking at the process behind it, something begins to feel off. Because the deeper you go, the less it looks like natural success, and the more it starts to feel like something that had to be controlled. And that's where the story begins to shift.
Long before the pressure became obvious, the pattern had already started forming. Judy Garland didn't grow up in a normal environment. There was no clear line between childhood and work, no space where she could simply exist without expectation. Everything was tied to performance, to output, to how she was perceived. Inside the studio system, especially under companies like MGM, young performers weren't just guided, they were managed in detail. Their appearance, their behavior, their routines, all carefully monitored. And in her case, one issue kept coming up again and again: her weight. She was told she didn't fit the ideal. Not thin enough, not refined enough, not exactly what the image required. So adjustments were made. Strict diets, limited food, constant pressure to maintain a certain look. But controlling appearance wasn't enough. The schedule demanded more. Early mornings, late nights, endless rehearsals, a pace that wasn't sustainable without intervention.
And that's where something else entered the picture. Small pills, introduced as solutions. Something to keep her awake, something to keep her going, something to maintain the energy expected from her. Amphetamines to stay alert, barbiturates to sleep. A cycle that, at the time, didn't seem unusual in that environment. It was treated as part of the system, part of the process, something necessary to keep everything running smoothly. And she was young enough to accept it, to trust that this was normal, that this was simply how things worked. But looking back now, it raises a different kind of question.
If your body is trained to rely on something before you even understand it, can you really call it a choice? Because by the time the effects became visible, the pattern had already been set, and what seemed manageable in the beginning was slowly becoming something much harder to control.
As her fame grew, the pressure didn't just increase, it intensified in ways that were harder to hide. Judy Garland was no longer just a young performer trying to prove herself. She had become a major investment, a face tied directly to success. And that meant expectations had to be met at all times. The schedule became relentless. Filming during the day, rehearsals at night, public appearances in between, with almost no time to recover. And the system that once seemed structured now started to show its limits. The cycle she had been placed into, something to sleep, something to wake up, something to keep going, was no longer just a tool, it was becoming a dependency. There were moments where it stopped working the way it was supposed to, moments where her body didn't respond the same way, where exhaustion broke through no matter what she was given. And that's when the cracks became visible. She began missing rehearsals, arriving late, sometimes not showing up at all. Reports started to surface about instability, about emotional strain, about behavior that didn't match the image people were used to seeing. At one point, she reportedly experienced a breakdown serious enough to halt production, something that could no longer be managed quietly behind the scenes.
To the public, it looked like she couldn't handle the pressure of fame, that success had simply become too much. That was the explanation people accepted. But it doesn't fully explain what was happening underneath. Because by this point, her body had been conditioned to function in a very specific way. And when that system began to fail, everything else followed. Eventually, the situation reached a point where the studio could no longer rely on her as before. She was suspended and later dismissed, a shift that didn't just affect her career, but her entire sense of stability. The system that had once controlled every part of her life was now pulling away, but what it left behind wasn't freedom, it was uncertainty. Because when something has shaped how you function for years, losing it doesn't restore control. It exposes how much control was never really yours to begin with.
By the time Judy Garland stepped away from the studio system, the damage wasn't something that could simply be undone. On the surface, it looked like freedom. No more contracts dictating her schedule, no more direct oversight controlling every decision. But the patterns that had been built over years didn't disappear. They remained in her routines, in her body, in the way she had learned to function. And this is where the story becomes more complicated. Because when people looked at her struggles later in life, they often saw them as personal failures, a lack of discipline, poor choices, an inability to manage success. But that interpretation leaves out the environment that shaped those behaviors from the beginning. The studio system didn't just manage careers, it managed people, their image, their time, their output, and in some cases, according to various accounts, how they coped with the demands placed on them. This wasn't necessarily an isolated experience.
Some sources suggest that similar patterns existed for other performers during that era, though each situation was different, and not all details are fully documented. There is no single moment where everything went wrong, no clear point where control was suddenly lost. Instead, it was gradual, a slow shift from structure to dependence, from guidance to something much harder to break away from. And when she tried to rebuild her life outside of that system, the reality she faced was very different from the one she had been conditioned for. Relationships became unstable, financial pressure increased, and the emotional toll became harder to manage. Because the expectations didn't disappear, but the structure that once supported them, flawed as it was gone. And without it, the cycle didn't stop. It simply became less controlled. Which leads to a more uncomfortable idea. If the system played a role in creating the conditions, then what responsibility does it carry for what came after? Because by the time she began to push back, to regain control over her own life, something had already shifted in a way that wasn't easy to reverse.
By this stage, the gap between who Judy Garland was on stage and who she was off stage had become impossible to ignore. In front of an audience, she was still extraordinary. The voice still powerful, the presence still magnetic.
The kind of performance that could hold a room completely still. For those moments, nothing seemed broken. But once the lights went down, everything shifted. Her career became increasingly unstable. Shows were canceled, appearances became unpredictable, and the reliability that once defined her image began to disappear. The industry responded quickly, as it always does, and the narrative around her started to change. She was no longer seen as flawless, but as difficult, inconsistent, someone who couldn't maintain what she once had. And once that perception takes hold, it becomes part of the story, whether it's accurate or not. At the same time, the pressure didn't ease, it transformed. Financial strain started to build, decisions became more urgent, and the emotional toll continued to grow. There were moments where it seemed like she was regaining control. Brief periods where things stabilized, where she connected with audiences in the way she always had. Her performances in London, for example, still drew crowds, still sold out, still proved that the talent hadn't disappeared. And that's what makes this part of the story so complex, because it wasn't a simple decline. It was a constant shift between control and collapse, between brilliance and instability, which makes what comes next even harder to understand. Because from the outside, it looked like she might be finding her way back, that after everything, there was still a path forward. But sometimes, what looks like recovery isn't actually recovery at all. It's just a pause before something else happens. And that's where the story takes its most unsettling turn. In 1969, in London, the story came to an end. Judy Garland was found dead at the age of 47, and the official cause was an overdose of barbiturates, ruled as accidental according to reports at the time. On the surface, the explanation seems straightforward. She had a long history with these substances, and the outcome, while tragic, fits that pattern. But when you step back and look at the full timeline, it becomes harder to see it as a single moment. Because this didn't begin in her final years. It didn't suddenly appear. It had been part of her life for decades. Which raises a difficult question. If someone has been conditioned to rely on something for that long, where does responsibility actually begin? Some perspectives suggest that her death was not just the result of one event, but the outcome of a much longer process, one that started early, developed gradually, and eventually reached a point where the line between use and dependence was no longer clear. Others argue that regardless of how it began, the choices later in life still mattered, that responsibility ultimately remains with the individual. And there are also more speculative views, questions about her final days, about the circumstances surrounding them, about what may or may not have contributed.
However, there is no confirmed evidence supporting alternative conclusions beyond the official findings. What remains is uncertainty, not necessarily about the cause itself, but about how it came to that point. Because when a pattern exists for so long, shaped by multiple influences, it becomes difficult to separate where it started and who controlled it. And that's what makes this part of the story so uncomfortable. Not just what happened, but everything that may have led to it. Looking back, the story of Judy Garland is often remembered through her performances, the voice, the presence, the moments that defined an era and continue to resonate long after. Those moments are real, and they still matter, but they are only part of a much larger picture. Because behind the success was a system that demanded consistency, control, and perfection at a level that few people could sustain without consequence. And meeting those expectations came at a cost that isn't always visible when you're only looking at the result. This isn't just a story about one person struggling. It's about how those struggles can be shaped over time, how environments influence outcomes in ways that aren't always obvious in the moment. And maybe that's the part that stays with you. Not just how it ended, but how long it had been building before anyone truly questioned it. Because the real question isn't only about what happened in 1969. It's about everything that happened before it. The pressure, the structure, the decisions, and whether the line between choice and conditioning was ever as clear as it seemed. Maybe the truth is more complicated than we want it to be.
If stories like this change the way you see fame and the people behind it, there's more to explore. Subscribe to follow more stories that go beyond the surface.